what a perfect segue into preaching. I'm just going to move the avocado and the bracelet. Is that right? I have actually brought a prop though today, which is very unusual for me when I preach. But I thought it does actually segue quite nicely. I brought some slippers. Anybody lost any slippers? No, these are my slippers. These are very, very nice slippers. I'll tell you about the slippers in a minute. So we've just started this new year, a new season, a new series in preaching, and we're looking at the Gospel of John. I'm going to just put my stopwatch on because I know that I get carried away. So if I put my stopwatch on, that'll encourage me not to go on too long. Hopefully. Pray for me and for yourselves. Have you ever had something for a long time or done something for a long time and you've been quite happy with it and it's going well and you like it, but then you get something different, like a different version, an upgrade or a different way of doing things, and you think, how on earth did I miss this? Like, why have I been doing it this way so long? This is so much better. These are my slippers, okay? Very nice. If you want to come and touch them, you can. They're like, Paul's garment. You can come and touch them. Anything could happen to you if you touch these slippers. You might catch something, I don't know. But for many years, I wore the sort of traditional slippers, the slip-on ones, with no back. You just go in, you can sort of skate into them and slide down the old hallway. And they were really convenient, and they're reasonably comfy, but they kind of get out of shape quite quickly, and, they get tatty around the edges. And then about a year ago, my kids bought me these slippers. Now, in my house, the only way I get anything new, clothes, anything, is by other people buying it, because I don't really like to part with money, and I just like to keep wearing things until they literally do fall off me. A pair like this about a year ago, and they were a fortune. I found out how much they were. I won't tell you how much they were, but they were very expensive, and I was like, I've never paid that much for slippers. In fact, I've never paid that much for trainers or anything, really, in my life. And the kids bought them, and I was a bit annoyed. I was like, why have you spent so much on slippers? And then I put them on. Oh, man. It's like a sleeping bag for your feet. So warm, so cozy, so comfortable. And you know what? This is my second pair of the same type. These are North Face. Other brands are available, but these are incredibly comfortable. And I was like, wow, I'll never want to go back to those old rubbishy slippers that I used to buy, like from the sale counter at Sports Direct, which is where I always go to if I ever have to buy trainers, like the really cheap ones that don't last very long. These are amazing. And I was thinking about it that, like whether you're a Christian or not, your life can become like a comfortable pair of slippers. In fact, I used to work with somebody who said the job that we used to have, he said, I don't really like the job. I don't really want to move. It's just like a comfortable pair of slippers. It's kind of all right. I kind of know what to expect. It's going pretty well. It's okay. It doesn't demand too much of me. And our lives can become a little bit like that. They're comfortable enough. They're familiar. We know what to believe. We know what to expect. And generally, we're sort of fairly content with that. And I think contentment is a really underrated virtue. I think contentment is incredibly lacking, certainly in my life and in other people's lives, to people I speak to. But I do think that God wants to continually disrupt us in a good way. I think that he wants to confound our expectations, to surprise us, to take us deeper, and to reveal more of his disruptive glory. That's a phrase that I came up with this week. I probably read it somewhere else. I don't think it's original to me. It can't be. But I thought, this is what Jesus does. He wants to show us his disruptive glory. When he reveals who he is, he doesn't leave anything the same. And we see it in two encounters today in the early part of John's Gospel, where Jesus comes and he disrupts what is comfortable. He disrupts what is expected. He disrupts what is the status quo. Jesus loves us too much to allow us to settle for less than who he is and what he has for us. So we're going to read from John chapter 2, and I think Max is going to come and do that for me. I love Max's voice. He's got one of the nicest voices of anybody I've heard. Nicest reading voice ever. But he's very quiet, so you might have to boost him. So it's John chapter 2. It's quite a long passage. It's verse 1 to 25. Oh, there's some slippers. Not as nice as mine. Here we go. Max.
Thanks, Ian. No pressure. Cool. So, John chapter 2, verse 1 to 25. It says, Jesus changes water into wine. On the third day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." "Woman, why do you involve me?" Jesus replied, "My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water." So they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet." They did so. And the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, "Everyone brings out the choice wine first, then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best till now." What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and brothers and his disciples. There they stayed for a few days. Jesus clears the temple courts. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple courts, he found... Cool. So when it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple courts, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. So he made a whip out of cords and drove all from the temple courts, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. To those who sold doves, he said, "Get this out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a market." His disciples remembered that it is written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." The Jews then responded to him, "What sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all this?" Then Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days." They replied, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you are going to raise it in 3 days?" But the temple he had spoken of was his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples recalled what he had said. Then they believed the scripture and the words that Jesus had spoken. Now while he was in Jerusalem at the Passover festival, many people saw the signs he was performing and believed in his name. But Jesus would not entrust himself to them, for he knew all people. He did not need any testimony about mankind, for he knew what was in each person.
Brilliant. Thank you, Max. So there's 2 events that John describes in the early part of his gospel. The first one's a wedding. And it was no sort of particularly special event. It was a fairly ordinary thing that happened. And it was in a place, Cana in Galilee, which is like a pretty northern backwater town. Nothing exciting really happens in Cana. And Jesus and his disciples, the first few disciples at this point that he'd called, were invited to this wedding along with Jesus' mother, Mary. So it could possibly have been a relative of the family. And the festivities have been going on for a while, and, there's been lots of eating and drinking and music and dancing, and they get to this wherever it was in the banquet, and the wine runs out. Now, that would be quite embarrassing even now, wouldn't it? If you were at a wedding and you ran out of booze, even if it's non-alcoholic, it'd still be pretty embarrassing. But we probably could go, well, actually, somebody, can you just nip out to Bargain Booze or Tesco or whatever? Somebody could nip out and get a carry back. But in those days, it wasn't quite as easy as that. And not only that, it would have been, whilst it would have been embarrassing, it would be embarrassing for us now. actually in Jewish culture, it's a shame and honor culture. So something like that, when you run out of something you're meant to be catering for others, as like apparently it was the bridegroom who was responsible for catering at a Jewish wedding. So to run out would have actually been quite shameful. It would have brought sort of dishonor to him and to the family as well. So it was much more than just a little bit of embarrassment that we might feel today. And Mary knew that Jesus was capable of preventing this shame. Now, John says this is the first sign that Jesus performed through which he revealed his glory. So the implication there is that up to this point in Jesus' life, for 30 years or so, Jesus had never revealed his glory. He'd never shown a sign. That's John's way of saying a miracle, essentially something that was extraordinary that would reveal Jesus' deity. And yet Mary still expected Jesus to do something in this situation. Perhaps, well, definitely Mary expected more than anyone in that room, but we don't actually know what she expected. Maybe she just expected Jesus to go and create a bit of a diversion. Like, because Jesus should have known that Jesus was a great teacher and he started to gather crowds. So maybe she just expected him to do a bit of teaching and people would forget about the fact that there was no wine left. We don't know. It doesn't say. And Jesus at that point was saying, actually, I'm not actually ready to reveal my glory yet. And yet. So his mum pushes him into it, basically. His mum pushes him into it. And Jesus actually does rebuke her, doesn't he? Tells her off. He says, "Woman, why do you involve me? My hour has not yet come." And apparently looking at that, woman sounds quite harsh, doesn't sound like a bit of a disrespectful term, but in the word that was used there, the Aramaic word isn't a term of disrespect. It's just kind of like, what's it got to do with us? It's not our gig, this. So why are we getting involved? And actually, this isn't really my time. I don't want to reveal my glory. And yet, Jesus goes and does it, doesn't he? Mary's expectation, Mary's presumption encourages Jesus to respond. And that can be the same for us, can't it, in our lives, in our prayer lives with God. We must never really presume that God should do anything for us. Paul in Romans says, what can I give? What have I ever given to God that I deserve him to do anything for me? I mean, what have we given to God that we should presume he should do anything for us? And yet, in his grace, in his mercy, he responds to people like us. He will do it his way. And often he'll do more than we expected as well. And it's just because God's so gracious that even when we're presumptuous, even when we don't deserve it, God will often give us more than we even ask. And Mary did urge Jesus to act, but she then, I think, realizes she's been a bit presumptuous, and she says to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." She realizes that he will act, but he's going to do it in his way. Do you ever pray in a way, I know some of you do, because I've heard you do it, and I do it. Do you ever pray in a way where you say, "Okay, God, I've got this situation, and what happens is this, and this person's really struggling, and what's happening in their lives is this, and what we really need you to do, God, is this, this, and this." So you kind of like tell God what the situation is, even though obviously he already knows, and then you tell him what he needs to do about it, and then that's it. That's kind of the end. We sort of pray in a way that we're almost wanting to control God, and again, we can't presume that God would do anything the way we would do it. And yet he's gracious. He does it in his way, not necessarily ours. So Jesus directs the servants to fill up some huge jars of water, and they had 6 of them, and they hold between 20 and 30 gallons. That's 75 to 115 litres. It's a lot of liquid. So these big jars were used in ceremonial washing. If you were a Jew and you were coming to prepare to worship, you would wash yourself, often as some people still do today. And I know Muslims do that as well before they pray. And it was in the Old Testament law. It was part of the reminder that God is holy and the reminder that we're not, and that we can't just presume to come to God as we are. We have to wash ourselves. And because this household owned 6 jars, it is quite likely that they were actually a priestly family to have 6 of these massive jars, which would have been very expensive, very heavy. They were very, very concerned with ritual purity. So they could have even been from a priestly family. So they fill up these jars with water, and the master of the banquet takes a sip, and he's blown away. He tastes it's wine, but it's not just like the wine they've been drinking. It's like the best wine. It's like, I don't know if you ever did this, but like when we were first, I drink wine, I drink beer, not lots, but I do like a drink. And near Christmas once, somebody bought us a bottle of Chateau de Neuf de Pape. Is that even how you pronounce it? Probably put an extra D in there. Chateau Neuf de Pape, maybe? Yeah. It's very expensive. It's like over £10 bottle of wine. And you go, is that funny? Obviously, the people at the back are going, that's nothing, that's just cheap wine. 30 or 40 pounds is more my style. But I don't ever drink like, the cheapest like £3 stuff that leaves a residue on your mouth and your lips and gives you a massive headache no matter how much you drink. And we drank this at Christmas once. I was like, whoa, it's like velvet. It's like my slippers. I didn't realize these things existed. They're so much better. And that's what it was like. It was like, whoa, you've left this amazing wine. Why have you left that? Usually when people are drunk, they'll drink anything. So we could give them the cheapest stuff you can get from Aldi. But actually they bring out this wine and it's the best stuff that they've ever tasted. It exceeds his expectations, doesn't it? And the result was that the bridegroom, instead of being shamed and dishonored in his insufficiency, he didn't have what he needed to provide. He was honored. And it's a great picture, isn't it, of what Jesus does for us. When we come to Jesus, in fact, I think to come to Jesus, to become a Christian, you have to come to the end of yourself. You can't think that you've got it all sorted out. You can't go, I'm sufficient enough, I know what I'm doing, I've got my life sorted, I'm strong, I'm brave, I'm kind, I'm wise, and yet I'll add God onto it. No, you can't do that. To come to Jesus, you have to say, I don't have it all worked out. I've got vulnerabilities and insecurities that nobody knows about. I need you, God. And it's a great picture. Instead of the shame that would be ours because of the secrets we hold and the sin that entangles us, Jesus replaces that shame with glory. He gives us honor instead of dishonor. It's a great picture of what happens when you become a Christian, and he still wants to do that throughout our Christian lives. But Jesus isn't just being kind, he's also fulfilling Old Testament prophecy. And as he does this, you see it more and more through John's Gospel. Jesus starts to fulfill the Old Testament. All of the Old Testament is pointing to Jesus, and Jesus is gradually revealing the signs that will show who he is and the fulfillment of them. One of them that came to mind when I was reading this was Isaiah 55. Many of you will have read parts of it before. It says this, "Come all who are thirsty, come to the waters, and you who have no money, come buy and eat. Come buy wine and milk without money and without cost. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." When the self-sufficiency of the wedding planners had run out, there was Jesus. When the fear and shame and dishonor ensued, there was Jesus. He did more than they could ever imagine, and he did it all for free. God's ways often confound our expectations, don't they? We expect God to do something, and sometimes he doesn't do it. In fact, in my experience, God very rarely does things the way I expect him to. That's been my experience as a Christian. And if I'm honest, sometimes I've been disappointed with God because I've prayed for this situation or this person to change, and God hasn't done it. He confounds our expectations. But the promise is that his ways are higher. His thoughts are so much better. All the good things that I can imagine for myself and for other people, God can do much more than that. If you think that you care about the welfare of somebody else, God cares infinitely more. If you think that you've got a good idea for the benefit of somebody else, God's ideas far outweigh yours. That's the promise of Scripture. We might not always get what we want and the way we want it. God will act, but he'll do it his way, not ours. And Jesus offers this fullness of life to us, doesn't he? And he offers it freely and abundantly, but we can't recognize it until we come to the end of ourselves. That's true when you first come to Jesus, but it's still true if you've been on the road a while. How easy is it for me to become self-sufficient after all these years of walking this road, trying to make Jesus the center of my life? How often do I lapse back into the old ways of I can do things. I know what's best, even in my prayers. God, I know what I want to pray and what I want from you, and I'll kind of put you in your little box and compartmentalize God into that little bit of my life, and I live my life sometimes as if actually Jesus wasn't even part of it. And it's a real challenge to me. How self-sufficient am I right now? How much actually do I need to remember that God's ways are higher, that I need him, and that he has much more for me than I could ever imagine for myself. So that's the first event. The second event comes quickly after it, and it's the Passover time. There is some debate about which Passover this was. John puts it at the start of his gospel. The other gospel writers have another Passover event that Jesus clears out the temple later, right near his death. But we're not going to get into that right now. It's controversial. But Jesus goes to this Passover festival, and he finds all sorts of things happening in the outer courts of the temple. And it's where animals were being sold. So people would come from miles around to buy animals for the sacrifice that they would make at the temple. So it seems reasonable, really, that actually they would they would offer that service at the temple itself. Because otherwise you've got to carry a lamb on your back, however many miles, along with whatever else you bring in. And so it seemed pretty convenient, pretty reasonable. And they also have to pay a temple tax to enter the temple. And so if you're from not around there, you might not have the local currency. So they provide a service so you can change your money into the temple tax currency. It seems reasonable, really. So why was Jesus so miffed about it? Why was he so angry? Well, the thing is, the Jews could go to these temple courts and get all these bits and bobs before they go into the temple. And so that outer court wasn't that important to them. It was almost like the foyer. They could get what they needed, and then they came in to the temple. But the non-Jewish converts, people who weren't born Jews, they couldn't go into the temple. They weren't allowed. That was part of the restriction of the law. They weren't allowed in the temple because they weren't Jewish by birth. So the only place they could go to worship was in the foyer, was in the outer court, the court of the Gentiles, they called it. So Jesus was livid. Why? Because the very place that the non-Jews, the outsiders, could go to worship was being turned into like a market stall. They couldn't pray because there must have been all sorts of noises and smells and sounds and all sorts of shouting going on as well, bartering maybe and all that sort of stuff. The non-Jews are being hindered from worship by people that just didn't seem to really care. The Jewish leaders, the religious leaders, the temple elite, they didn't seem to mind. And Jesus comes in and says, no, you're hindering these people from prayer and worship, and you don't even care. And I think that's kind of like the very worst of any club, a sports club, golf clubs tend to come to mind, how snobby some of them can be, unless you're wearing the right clothes, unless you got your own bag of clubs, unless you come and, you're seen as an outsider. Working men's clubs and all sorts of different places. Not all of them are like that, but you've probably experienced some of this, who's in and who's out. They make it really obvious that you're not that welcome unless you've got a membership. And unfortunately, churches have been like that many over the years. And sometimes we go to church, and if you're a visitor today, I really hope that's not been your experience, because that's not my perception of this church. And I'm really, really glad, because I think people make people feel really welcome. But and I think it's an absolutely low benchmark, isn't it? To make somebody feel welcome is not hard to do. We can all do that. And I think we do it really well in this church. But we have to be careful that we don't slip into that we don't miss the outsiders because we're so consumed with our own needs and the other people that are here every week. And Jesus was livid about that. And the temple had become a bit of a religious institution as well, hadn't it? It was kind of valuing this business over prayer and worship. And again, we've seen that in the church over many decades, that business and money and finance and assets have become more important than prayer and worship. And if I'm honest, how often do I see it in myself sometimes? My business, my money, my job, how much more important is that in my life? How much more time do I devote to that than prayer and worship? Jesus wouldn't settle for it. In fact, the disciples realized after that he was so zealous that he was fulfilling another prophecy in Psalm 69, verse 9. He said, his disciples remembered that it's written, zeal for your house will consume me. But there's another prophecy that came to mind as I read this, and it was from Malachi 3, verses 1 to 4. This is a few hundred years before Jesus came, and it's a picture of what God wants to do with his people and the temple. I will send my messenger who will prepare the way before me. Then suddenly the Lord you are seeking will come to his temple. The messenger of the covenant whom you desire will come, says the Lord Almighty. But who can endure the day of his coming? Who can stand when he appears? For he will be like a refiner's fire or a launderer's soap. He'll sit as a refiner and purifier of silver. He will purify the Levites and refine them like gold and silver. Then the Lord will have men who will bring offerings in righteousness, and the offerings of Judah and Jerusalem will be acceptable to the Lord, as in days gone by, as in former years. Jesus, the messenger of God, came to refine and purify the priesthood, the Levites, the people that were in charge of worship, and the temple, so that offerings might be acceptable once again to God. And he does the same for us. Without Jesus, our offerings are not acceptable to God. We cannot cleanse ourselves. No amount of ceremonial washing, no amount of religious duty, no amount of reading the Bible or going to church is going to cleanse us for God. Only Jesus can do that. Jesus comes. He is the refiner's fire. And he comes and he cleanses us. He offers us a new start. He offers us a way to God. And the Jews responded to him, "What sign can you show us to prove your authority? Can't believe that Jesus is doing this. Who is this guy? What does he think he's doing? Who does he think he is?" And Jesus says, "Destroy this temple and I'll raise it again in 3 days." Jesus was clearly talking about his own body, wasn't he? And the disciples didn't recognize it at the time. The temple of God was a physical foreshadow, a pattern of what was to come. The temple was the place where you could come and meet with God, and God would meet with you. Jesus comes and he replaces the temple. He supersedes it. He's so much greater than the temple. We've sung this morning, our God is greater. Jesus is so much greater than the temple ever was. He was God in flesh, the new and living temple. He is the great high priest. He replaces all need for priests and sacrifice. He is Emmanuel, God with us. The temple was good. It wasn't a bad thing. The temple was good. It was God's idea. The law was good. It was God's idea. But it was superseded by Jesus. He was better by far. He comes to say, I've come to replace that. I've come to fulfill all the longings you've always had for God. And the disciples, like the rest of the religious establishment, couldn't imagine the extent of Jesus' glory. He exceeded and confounded everybody's expectations. And I think he still does. So, coming into land now. What can we learn that's relevant? What might we pick out from these two accounts? Well, the first thing is that Jesus does come to disrupt. He's not just Jesus, gentle, meek and mild. I'm just going to come. It's okay. Just love everybody and just carry on the way you are. That's not love. That's not God. Jesus comes to disrupt. He comes to challenge, to confound, to surprise. And he does it in his way. He disrupts the status quo. He does things that are totally unexpected. His love is too great, and his mission is too important to allow us to settle for less than all his glory. And the other thing from these two accounts, if you compare the two accounts, on the one account, the wedding party, Jesus comes to those who come to the end of their own resources, and they were given an abundant gift to cover their dishonor and their shame. But in the second account, those who relied on their own resources, those temple traders, were sent away in shame, scrambling for money and running after the animals that they came to sell. That's the picture of the gospel. Come to the end of yourselves and say, God, I can't do it. Jesus comes. But if you think you can do it on your own, Jesus will go, sorry, I never knew you. Send you away in shame. And it's an absolute challenge to us today. I think both things are still true. I'm going to invite the band to come back just with a few questions to ask and give us a few minutes to think about them. So questions to close. Where might I have settled for business as usual in my life? Where have you become settled? In what ways might Jesus be inviting me to expect more from him? And in our sort of circles, often that people go, well, just expect, we want more miracles, we want more healings. And obviously that stuff's true, we do. But I'm not just talking about that. I'm not just going, I want more from God, as in, I want God to do more for me. I'm saying, What is he inviting you to expect more? As in, he is greater, he's bigger, he's to enlarge our imaginations, to open our hearts, to recreate us, to reimagine what is possible as we follow him. Thirdly, how might Jesus be disrupting me to help me focus on what's more important? What might be happening in your life at the moment that's actually really disruptive? How might God be using that to actually disrupt you, to become uncomfortable? I think that's the thing. It's not a harsh thing. It's I think somebody said it something like this: Jesus disrupts the comfortable and comforts the disrupted. He does it because he loves you too much to leave us falling short of his glory, of experiencing less of the fullness of life that he wants for each one of us. This series invites you to look, come further up, come further in, to expect more, to see more of the beauty, the glory, the wonder of Jesus. May that be true for you. May that be true for me in the coming days and weeks.